Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. Today's guest is Jessica Horn, a Pan-African feminist activist, a writer, a technical advisor on women's rights with a focus on body politics, social movements, philanthropy, and building scenarios for feminist futures. She's currently works as the director of programs for the Accra-based African Women's Development Fund. And she has been one of the lead people involved in the interesting document produced by AWDF on the futures of Africa, trends for women by 2030. So a warm welcome to you, Jessica. Thanks for joining. And it's so nice to see you again after so many years.
It's been years, but it's good. Reunions are always good.
Yes. Well, I wish I could raise a glass, but anyway, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Jessica, I was very interested to get your perspective as an African feminist on the current situation of COVID, in particular across our continent, across Africa, but of course more generally as well. What, from a feminist perspective, are you wanting to highlight the key issues that you see being faced by women and in the struggle for their own emancipation and emancipation of humanity?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So it's interesting. I mean, the way that I see, and I think many African feminists see the COVID crisis is really just shining a magnifying glass on existing structural inequalities. Fortunately, the pandemic has yet to hit the African region in a health way in terms of infection rates, in the same way that it's hit parts of Asia, North America, and Europe. And we hope it stays that way. But what it has shown is, again, sort of a lack really of social protection, a lack of health systems, access to economic support, for everybody, but in particular for the most marginalized. And as we know, the most marginalized in the African continent, frankly, in the world, but also in the African continent, are women. So the pandemic is inexplicably gendered. There is no way to get around that. But the other thing is that in a lot of the policies that have been put in place to respond to COVID-19, there really hasn't been attention to the fact of the gendered implications. So, for example, lockdowns. Any feminist would know the idea that staying home is a way to be safe is questionable, because we know the rates of intimate partner violence. We know the rates, of vulnerabilities to people inside the home, right, that are based on patriarchal power and people's autonomy in the home. And so the home is not necessarily a safe space in general, though it may be a place where you may not contract COVID-19. Similarly, with the measures around decisions around the economy, the fact of the matter is that a majority of African women participate in the economy in informal ways, and in the agrarian economy. And in those contexts, really, it's about subsistence living, and it's about a daily wage. And most of that is largely outside of formal economic systems, which means that any provisions that you put in place to support the laborers, to support workers, is most likely going to miss a majority of African women. So there are a lot of concerns that COVID-19 has raised. And again, there have been lockdowns widespread across the continent. And even though the health impact is yet to be felt, the economic impact is absolutely being felt, as is the social impact. And as I mentioned, in particular, when it comes to the question of violence.
There's been quite a lot of data published in a number of countries internationally about this increasing scale of both domestic violence and child abuse. Do we have comparable figures from Africa?
So what's difficult is that on the continent, there are only a couple of countries that really have sort of more reliable national data that's collected on a regular basis. But certainly anecdotally, we see that. So I work for an African feminist women's rights fund called the African Women's Development Fund. And through our partners, we're definitely hearing that. So for example, Rape Crisis Cape Town went ahead and actually preempted and set up a hotline, an additional hotline service, because they knew what would happen. Remember that also children are being sent home from school, so it means that girls are being sent back to families, or if they didn't have, families close to the vicinity, they're being sent somewhere for someone to look after them. So there's multiple vulnerabilities, different constituencies of women, different ages. So we're absolutely seeing that everywhere. There's been a spike in cases in Uganda. The police have actually reported that. So there is information there, but there's also an anecdotal sense of that trend. Absolutely. And again, it was to be expected, because when you reduce people's ability to be mobile, yeah, you're reducing their ability to get out, and so that's a concern. Also, remember that not everybody lives in one place. I mean, there's a lot of migrants, and African women migrants, and particular migrant workers. So, for example, the Saudi government, as a result of COVID-19, had actually decided to deport a whole load of workers back to Ethiopia, and a large number of those are Ethiopian women who are working as domestic workers. So there's this large kind of just shipment of women back, and again, most of those women migrated because they didn't have opportunities or necessarily safe spaces where they were, and people have gone in search of opportunity, and they've just been returned en masse, again, with no provision for their health, in the process, and no real protections for them around contracting COVID. So there's a lot of different sorts of, obviously, like, given the full diversity of the constituencies that African women represent, there's a lot of concerns and pressures faced by different people.
You mentioned a little earlier on about the marginalization of women. I wonder if I could just challenge that perception and open this discussion up, because it seems to me that small-scale agriculture is the source of the major source of food for everyone. This is planetarily, it's true, and certainly in Africa. And we know, because of the way in which colonialism operated and the way in which that has continued afterwards, that women are the main farmers, the main structures of that. And without them, the low wages that workers earn in the cities wouldn't be possible without the support in terms of, to use the technical term, the social reproduction of labor. So I would argue that far from being marginal, which I think is probably donor speak as well, that actually, on the contrary, they're central. And so when a crisis like this occurs, is it not exactly the point that they are now suffering in a much greater extent than they were when they were absolutely central to the economy?
Yeah, I like the reformulation. And really, when we're talking about marginality, we're talking about marginality in the ruling or hegemonic system of power. So it's not to say that African women don't have the capacity, don't have the knowledge, don't lead the work. It's whether or not that is recognized in the system of power, and whether or not the system of power is then acknowledging that and making provisions for it. So that's the issue. So it's not that there's some sort of inherent inability or inherent lack of power. It's more that the system of power sometimes just ignores, or sometimes explicitly chooses to additionally marginalize by not noting that. Absolutely. So when it comes to the agricultural sector, I haven't yet heard any economic plan that acknowledges that African women are basically the subsistence food producers of the continent and feed the continent. And so therefore there needs to be some specific, plan put in place to help people. I mean, if there are lockdowns, it means you can't be tending to your fields, depending on where you're working, etc. So there's lots of things that happen even in agriculture, in the context of a crisis like this. I haven't heard that, because people don't think that way. People are thinking about large-scale business and, how to help out the big farms, etc. They're not thinking about subsistence farming. So this is exactly the point. Another point is about care work. So for example, African women make up a majority of nurses on the continent in the formal health care provision, and also make up not an insignificant number of doctors. I read the statistics somewhere, I should have prepared it for it, but I think it's somewhere almost 20% of doctors. And so again, to take that into account also in some of the planning, acknowledging that women often have multiple care roles. So what happens when women are on a front line, if they're then exposed to the virus, as we've seen in the global north, health workers are amongst those who are most affected because you're exposed to the virus constantly. And what does that mean in terms of social protections and safety nets for the people that they look after in the private sphere? So again, the problem is not that we're inherently unable. It's the opposite, is that we're able, but the system of power does not acknowledge it. And therefore, again, all of the thinking, the discussion, the commentary, thinking about the impact is not on us. Just last to say that, one of the things that unfortunately the lockdowns did was to give more power to what is already a very aggressive police and security force, right? And so in countries that are already notorious for policing their citizens, it just got worse because basically the police had more powers to really clamp down on people in curfews and in lockdowns. And so we've seen that with women traders in particular, that there's been quite a lot of police brutality. And again, there haven't really been provisions made to think about, well, what are women doing trading in, that environment, and how do we make sure that people are, that the policing is done in a manner that's respectful of, how people are operating, etc. So really, it's a systemic issue. It's about patriarchal power, and the patriarchal power is the thing that makes women marginalized.
And that's something I'd like to sort of build up on the issue of power, because it seems to me that rather than dealing with isolating people who are infected, caring for them and making sure you trace who they've had been in contact with and making a strategy of care, that is what normally in an epidemic needs to happen. Rather than that, what we are seeing, and several people that we've interviewed on this program have emphasized this, is that the state is using this opportunity to militarize the streets. In Kenya, for example, for a period, there were more people being killed by the police than were being affected by the infection. And there is, even today, a curfew, which means, as one bus from one of the ghettos in Kenya said, it's like being in prison. We are let out during the daytime to enjoy the sun, and then come evening, we get locked up. And I think this issue of power is clearly central. And it's, as you say, it is not that women don't have power. The question is what can lead to the organizing of power in a time of COVID. What are the possibilities? What does the African Development Fund, African Women's Development Fund, see this as? What are the basis for building up that potential power?
Sure. I mean, okay, it's a time when, again, any time of crisis is actually a time of consciousness raising, because for people who don't already see the problem, oftentimes when you then face injustice, it's a moment when political consciousness can be sparked, right? Or at least the kind of the overall politics becomes relatable, because you can really see in tangible terms what it means to be oppressed, and you feel it in your own life. So there's a mobilizing potential there. What we see African women's organizations doing is in part just trying to struggle and cope, because you have to remember that African women who staff those organizations are situated in exactly the same context. So we're dealing with exactly the same things and come from a variety of backgrounds, some of which are backgrounds that mean that they're more affected in terms of some of the policing issues, etc. So people are struggling in the very same environment. However, there is, people who maybe do more policy advocacy or work in that domain have been transitioning to do some extent of humanitarian outreach, etc. Although bearing in mind that that really is state responsibility. And so there's also this line a lot of people are trying to juggle around working out, do we try and solve the immediate needs, but also point a finger at who should be and to really try to name and articulate what we expect of the state going forward into the future. The second thing is that actually a lot of people are really affected by the emotional anxiety. So, unfortunately, most people have had relatively stressful experiences of their own health systems when it comes to serious illness. And so what this is doing is triggering for a lot of people just a worry that if it does come to really affect their communities, that people may not survive because just literally the health service itself, they know probably couldn't deal with such a complex health problem. And that's actually leading to a lot of anxiety. At AWDF, we created it's an online space for emotional well-being. We just invited anybody who wanted to participate in English and French, just in online sessions with coaches that we use to just talk about that and actually kind of try to deal with some of the anxiety and emotional stress that the impacts of all of this sort of matrix of COVID policies and COVID realities and COVID worries has created. In practical terms, though, like I said, people then started with the service responses, activist service responses around legal and psychosocial and health response. People have been doing public awareness because they realize that some of the messaging is not getting out to communities, some amount of humanitarian. What's exciting me most are really some really fascinating discussions around people who look at African policy in general from a feminist perspective and look at the region around thinking about where forward with this. Because what this has done is sort of brought everything to a standstill, and it's providing an opportunity very quickly to reevaluate and think about what next. And there are a lot of policies and potentials being put in place now, which could go in one direction or the other, could further re-entrench what we're already dealing with, or could potentially lead to even, into better policy positions. As you identified, though, it's a struggle because the states that we're working with are of varied progressiveness and have varied levels of interest in a transformative agenda. So people are trying hard and people are really putting their heads together to think about how do we leverage this to kind of create a broader opportunity for activism, but just bearing in mind that sort of a majority sway in the policy arena is towards more mainstream approaches, in particular around, lending, international lending, etc., to try and deal with some of the crisis, economic and otherwise, that people are facing.
Yeah, we talked about power and the opportunities created, in a sense, by a crisis like we're facing now. But as Arundhati Roy pointed out, this is a portal. It could go either. I'm sure that the ruling class are themselves quite clear of the opportunities for them that they could be taking. And I just wonder to what extent that search for opportunities in terms of power rather than policy is going on. I mean, I pose this question to you because one of the striking things that we found is some of the most organized, active, coherent, articulate militants from the ghettos that we've spoken to are strong women. They are the leaders of those struggles. Now, it seems to me that that's an opportunity. So where does AWDF play itself in terms not so much of policy, but on creating the alternative power and alternative, in a sense, an alternative way of living, another paradigm?
Sure. I mean, AWDF, I feel like I could speak with two voices because I'm Jessica as an activist who's been part of this movement for a good old 2 decades or so. And then there's AWDF. AWDF is a fund, and we fund registered entities, we fund organizations, and through them fund movements. Because as you know, with funding, it's quite difficult to fund sort of informal structure directly. Very few funds actually do that, even though we talk about funding movements. I mean, at the moment, our approach really is to just have an ear to the ground. We're looking at the whole continent, and basically there's a variety of things going on and a range of things articulated. We do keep posing the question of what next and where next, and really encouraging that thought process, and also really looking out for people that are articulating this idea of a what, because I hear a lot of people articulating what's wrong, but what's interesting is to hear a then what. But again, as a fund, we don't support individuals, for example. We wouldn't fund an individual to do a piece of work. So there's an institutional limit to some extent. But what we can do is provide space and networks and links and connections, and in particular to support the dialogue and the vision. So, I mean, and I'm not surprised in terms of like where you're seeing the axis of the kind of most radical thinking. It's usually people who have the least to lose from the current system that have the most visionary ideas about where to go, because, you know, we have less vested interest in keeping things the way they are. I think, though, that this is actually shown that regardless of who you are, no matter how much money you have, you're still vulnerable when it comes to something like this. That even a private hospital may not be able to help you, you know, and that, you know, the impact of being stuck in your house in terms of your ability to do X, Y, and Z is actually the same. Although you may not be the person being beaten by police because, you know, your car is slightly nicer, or you're in a car in the first place and not in a matatu. So, you know, those are things that I think are interesting, and I'm glad that you point out the class dynamics, because there is always a diversity when it comes to class in our region that we perhaps don't talk enough about. But yeah, I think like I said, I'm really excited by the opportunity of what this poses in terms of alternatives in a different way. I'm really excited though about thinking a little bit practically about it, because I think we are very good at articulating the critique. But I think this is really a chance to have some ideas about how. I think we also need to be a little patient with ourselves. As much as stimulus needs to happen and you need to build on energy, like it's a moment of great energy, it's only been 2 months, you know? It's actually only been 2 months. So even in organizing terms, unless you have an existing structure up and running, right? You have to be very smart about navigating. And what we're doing at the moment is using a lot of technological tools to unite people, because we can't physically be together. And there is a limit to that. Even with AWDF, we've seen like how many people have smartphones to be able to get on the internet, which is how people get on the internet, not on computers. You know, and who is it? So if you organize an event, is it going to be the ED there because they're the one with the best tech? Are you going to get, you know, someone more junior in the organization able to log on? So I think there's lots of sort of those issues there. But like I said, I'm excited by it. But I also I have a yearning to talk about what do we really mean? Like what can change? Yeah, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just thinking. No, one of the things that I do see. I mean, at the moment, I ended up in London, so I'm here in the midst of like a very bad pandemic and a bad epidemic nationally. And what I do find interesting is that really the Global South, it's a time for Global South solidarity to the North. But I also see a lot of the coverage around what's happening on the African region. And it was like this knee-jerk assumption that Africans would just get it all wrong and it would all not work well. And I find it interesting, for example, in the science, that in Senegal, similarly in Ghana, people have actually come up with incredibly affordable testing kits, for example, you know, that could be rolled out quite rapidly to a large number of people. And we know testing is a key way to, you know, understand what's happening and have people also deal with, you know, really understanding and being able to control their own health if they know whether or not they have COVID. So that's a win. You know, for all the technology and what have you in the UK, they're still struggling to work out how they're going to pay for mass testing. There's a lot of things I think that are happening right in the region that we also don't hear much about. And I think there could be better coordination also between African countries around that, in terms of sharing some of that insight and some of those technical tools.
Right. One of the things that you point out reminds me this thing about not being just negative critiques. Reminds me of Michelle Alexander's piece in the New York Times about a year ago, I think it was, in which she argued we are not the resistance. We are part of the movements trying to create a new world. It is they who are the resistance. It's the state and its policies and its police
Right.
and its arms. They are the resistance. And I think it's a really important thing, because one of my frustrations often is precisely this, that we should be thinking propositionally, not merely oppositionally, because there's a dead end, I think, it's not to say critiques don't have to be made, but what are where do we take this? I don't know what your feeling is about that.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and it's very true. And I think one has to be constantly reminded of it, because it often it can feel like that's not what it is, because I think they just feel like some sort of positions or vantage points or ways of being now that are so entrenched that it feels like there's just no air for anything else. I mean, I was raised on sort of the politics and the kind of energy of the liberation era. And if I think about, for example, what that era felt about what a government should do for its people and where we are now, it's upsetting, and it's hard to feel like that actually how a majority are and what a majority want is actually what the world should feel like, because I do feel like the people that rule us have done quite a good job of controlling that. And I think obviously one of the main things that they do to control is to control even the aspiration for transformation. So I think there's something to be said for that. Absolutely. But it's a mindset shift. It's a mindset shift.
I mean, I think that's a very important point, that the extent to which, and then Gogi wa Thiong'o talks about the way in which our minds are controlled as well. Let me shift the discussion slightly to an area which I feel much more work needs to be done on, perhaps, and that is what I would call upstream. The coronavirus is just one of a whole series of more and more dangerous viruses being generated by the industrial agricultural project, the industrial livestock production, and very importantly, the process of deforestation. Now, all three of these elements are ones which lead to a massive loss of land, primarily by women farmers. It's creating the conditions for further zoonosis, further transfer of virus or emergence of animal viruses moving into humans. And in Africa, it is the Bill Gates of the world. It's the Kofi Annans, I'm afraid, of the Agra. I like to call it agro, but never mind. The Agra project, which is about in a sense, a recolonization of our lands and the creation of conditions that will guarantee, we can be sure, the perpetuation of new viruses. Now, given that it is women who are centrally involved in the grabbing, the losing of land to these big industrial projects, how much attention is being paid by all of us to the upstream causes of these infections?
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of the actual origins of COVID, on this kind of thing, I always say, if I don't know, I don't want to actually postulate a thesis. So to be honest with you, I don't feel like I've actually looked deep enough into understanding the origins of this to really have a sense of where it comes from. So I don't want to attribute it to those causes necessarily. I know the main thesis that's on the table is that it's a transmission from bats, and interestingly, also analysis about why Chinese people came to eat bats in the first place, which was actually as a result of sort of growing inequality around access to food, unfortunately, actually in the Cultural Revolution, and people kind of going into, in essence, bushmeat as a way to get food because they had to go out and hunt and find it instead. In a way, what all it's saying, though, is it's the same mechanism. I mean, all the arguments in a way are pointing to just the same concern that's basically around structural inequality is actually what ultimately leads to disease emergence, you see? So in a way, I'm happy with that analysis of just understanding that structural inequality is actually the driver of pandemics. And in that respect, I mean, I think, yes, it is absolutely important when it comes to agriculture. AWDF supported a report some years back with the Gaia Foundation that was looking at African women's role as a keeper of seed and seed knowledge. I think it is, I mean, I do believe in the food sovereignty call, just because I believe that if you don't even have, I mean, always begin in the body. So if you don't have basic sovereignty over your own body, you know, how can you say that you're free? And similarly, if you don't have sovereignty even over the food that you can plant, how can you say that you're free? So I have serious concerns about the kind of intellectual property theft in many cases, but intellectual property grabs, and then the increasing kind of, you know, enabling of a certain kind of economic matrix that allows for people to not even have the right to propagate seeds that have been in their lineage for generations. I think it's so deeply problematic. I don't even know how that can be considered to be ethical. I understand people want to solve questions of people's access to food, but even there, we've seen all the analysis that shows that ultimately the reason why people don't have food is against structural inequality. There's so much food in this world. It's just how it's distributed is the issue, you know? So, so I think those really are serious questions. And like I said, I really think that raising questions about structural inequality is important, because we're not going to get through any of this. We're not going to find solutions for a majority if we don't ask the questions of why is it that people don't have that in the first place. And also that the autonomy of people is valid. It's a valid thing to want. I mean, if you see, for example, in the United States, with lockdown, they've hardly done lockdowns. Where they have, people are protesting their civil rights. They want to go shopping, you know, and they feel that it's a violation of their right to not have, you know, the ability to walk around, you know. So I mean, even in a neoliberal model of rights, people understand that everybody wants to be autonomous, you know. So I feel like that basic concern, you know, that Africans have, and certainly African women and certainly African feminists have around autonomy, including in relation to our food and to our land, is vital. Any movement in the world says if you do not have the land, you do not have the power. And that to me is something I think that's unavoidable to address.
Now, turning to the publication that you were partly responsible for, Futures Africa, Trends for Women by 2030. How would you have modified this in the light of the current growing crisis?
Yeah. So what's interesting is what this tried to do is we were in the process of a strategic planning process. And I just asked the question, well, guys, look, we're always talking about our work as propositional, as something about building a future that looks like X, Y, and Z. So if that's the case, when we do our planning, why do we look backwards? We need to look forwards to understand what may be coming at us and to actually strategize around that. So what that document is actually an analysis of all of the data sets we could find that gives some sense of where things are headed. So basically, if things happen at the same rate that they're going now, what would it mean for Africa, and in particular, what would it mean for women? It was the first time anybody had done anything like that at a regional scale. One of the downsides was that in terms of the data sets, we had to rely on development data from the sort of development industry and UN and large development agencies, because those are the people that actually capture the data. So some of the questions that they ask aren't quite the questions we would ask when it comes to each of the kind of themes. But it showed some interesting trends. So for example, the increasingly young nature of Africa, migration patterns, of burden of disease shifting. So one of the things, since we're talking about health to some extent here, is that by 2030, a majority of Africans, now we focus on that, so a majority of Africans will die of non-communicable diseases. So not your TBs and malarias anymore. Actually, what's going to be killing us is cancers, diseases of the heart, diseases related to lifestyle, nutrition, environmental pollution, etc., hypertension, diabetes, etc., lack of access to good food, all of that. And so it's interesting now what we have is a communicable disease that's kind of coming and, changing up some of those dynamics temporarily, although it could always happen again. In the futures process, what you do is you basically work out the trends as they look like they're evolving. And then you work out scenarios for what might happen if you intervene, and what could be a good, a bad, an ugly, strange. And I feel like what we're dealing with here falls a little bit into the wild card. HIV/AIDS was another wild card that happened. What's interesting for me is that in all of the strategic planning, so it's not just an organization like us, but usually larger organizations, even companies, etc., do this. What's funny for me is that nobody had planned for such a crisis. And it showed again that in some respects, our disaster preparedness at a macrostructural level is still very weak. And in a way, we should have learned some lessons because we've been here before. Whether it be Ebola or what have you, we've been here before. HIV, again, which did actually at some point spread very, very, very fast. We've been here before. So for me, it raises those questions, but it doesn't, methodologically, it doesn't necessarily raise different questions for how we did this. What I think is interesting, though, is to still take into account what's to then revise in a way and maybe think about what does this now mean? So it's altered migration for now. Will it continue to do so? And we perhaps want to pay attention to, again, some of the decision making around migration based on COVID to make sure that it doesn't become even more punitive for Africans. It's chained economies and economic power is going to shift. Well, we know that the large economies of the North are predicted for recession. So we have to have a think about what does that mean for the African region now. Again, where do we go with this in terms of the concern around Africa's economic autonomy? So it's interesting. Like I said, it's a bit of a wild card. At the same time, it's kind of things that we had seen before. I think it does have interesting implications to kind of graft onto what we'd already mapped out in terms of the trends as we see them for the future.
So what are the trends in relation to women organizing?
Well, you see, it's hard to, you can do, as they say, there are no facts in the future. So you cannot say, we are going to be like this or we're going to be like that in the future, because you just don't know. What you can say is we can plan for or try to encourage X, Y, and Z. So all we can see is sort of when it comes to political trends, they're really far more contingent. For example, it can be quite difficult to predict a coup in 20 years' time. You might be able to predict a coup in a year's time because you can get a sense of the power players and who's doing something now. But really, when it comes to futures work, that's done in this way, it's very difficult to predict for events that are highly contingent. But the other data and statistics do give us a sense of what we need to be doing. So for example, we cannot avoid the fact that the majority of the continent is young. I'm talking young, not AU definition of young, like proper young, adolescents, What are we doing about that? The political power structures as they exist formally are, for the most part, the gerontocracies, right? We have some very old people running running nations in Africa. As much as you would hope formal political leaders can see the needs of their constituents, I don't think that a youth voice is properly represented, or a youth vantage point of what people need, even in terms of how we budget. You know, what does really a majority young women need when it comes to what, you know, a nation is providing or a region is providing? We don't think like that, but we need to be. A second is around demographics and migration. Like, there's going to be a huge shift towards urbanization. And as we know, in the way that we've urbanized in the last couple of decades in a way that's quite unplanned, but also it creates severe inequalities. And again, those urban centers have not kept up with responding to the needs of the people that live in them. So infrastructure is a huge question, and infrastructure that is also for the people. So access to decent sanitation, decent housing, education that is not, you know, I mean, I believe in free education. I believe in state-funded education. And, you know, all of those questions around how we deal with the urban, you know, are vital. We can't run away from climate change. And again, this COVID-19, and as you talk about the impact in terms of interaction between environment and people, again, how are we really working that into how we're organizing? So for me, it was more like pointers of what we need to be doing. The whole thing, I mean, it's true that social media has taken over this, that, and the other, but also that I feel like that's something that we can also kind of shift around, because if we want to do things more offline, we can also just kind of do it. I feel like something about our modes of organizing are almost more in our control. And so that's something we just need to decide on and to do. But there are other shifts that are kind of pushed by factors that are slightly broader than us, but we need to be paying attention to them and making sure that we're not ignoring them.
One final question, although I would love to carry this conversation all through the next few hours, is the vocabulary, the language of feminism, in particular African feminism, was in its early days steeped in the idea of emancipation. For some reason, that word is it become a dirty word? Is it nobody talks about it? It's about infrastructure, structuring this policy, that policy. Am I being a bit too cynical?
Oh, so you mean in a broader narrative of kind of transformation rather than... I'm probably speaking in this way because I'm talking from an institutional perspective. And one of the points of entry is actually to work with systems as is, to also transform them, because people live in those systems. And so we need to do something about them. There is definitely, but it's underscored by a broader vision of feminist transformation, absolutely. But I feel like that's almost like the meta level vision, and then how we often talk amongst ourselves is really some of like the dynamics that happen on, you know, with regards to particular issues, because we also need to shift them up. I mean, the idea of being propositional is propositions about how we organize. Feminisms historically have been transnational and not particularly interested in aligning to nation states, but I think in African contexts, that varies. Like, there's the Pan-Africanism that's quite strong, but then there are also quite a lot of people who are wedded to thinking about their country. I do think that financing and the way that funding works has also kind of entrenched some of that, just because in terms of the resourced activism, most of that is resourced through formal mechanisms that tend to work in these quite nationally bound ways, and with regards to mainstream political and policy structures. So that I can see for sure. But there's definitely, like I said, a meta politics. It's just when we talk, I think now, well, a lot of the people I talk to, I think we're trying to zero in to work out how do we shift this and how do we shift that, because the project is very big, and I think you can do the meta analysis, but it is to inspire ways of thinking about how we change how we be and how we are. So ways of being and doing how we are, but also what we do and how we do it. And that part is vital, because we need to have ideas about the what. Yeah. So maybe what you're hearing is that I'm talking in the what, and I'm talking in part in relation to some of the realities of the structures that decide whether or not we have access to health. That's what creates the situation that we have, are these policies, are these governments, are these structures. So in a way, we have to engage them, and think about how we transform the dynamics around them.
Fascinating. Well, it's been just great to have you on the show, Jessica. I really appreciate your taking time. And I think, as we can see from the reaction to what you've been talking about, there's a lot of interest in the issues that have been raised here. So I want to thank you really very much for being on the show.
Thank you too for creating the space. It's brilliant, and I'm enjoying it. I'm going to keep listening to all of the different inputs. It's important, again, if it's a portal, then we're the ones that have to open the door or fly through. So,
Indeed. Yeah. Okay, well, you take care and look after yourself. And I hope we find an opportunity to get together face to face rather than just on screen. So
On
thanks
screen.
for joining us. Okay, Jessica.
Okay. Thank you very much, Feroz. Take care.
Okay. That was Jessica Horn from the African Women's Development Fund. Lots of interesting comments that have been made, lots of interesting issues being raised. I want to thank you for joining us today on organizing in the time of COVID-19. Tomorrow we move over to the Niger Delta, where we'll be speaking to activists there about the situation that is being faced, in which the oil companies have destroyed large horizons, and there is still a struggle around that, as well as a struggle against the threats of COVID. So I hope you'll join me then. This is Feroz Manji signing off for now.